Democracy, most democratic theorists seem to agree, is founded on equality. For Thomas Cristiano, democracy is founded on a principle of public equality, and democracy itself is the constitution of equality. For Robert Dahl, democracy developed in part because of the diffusion of what he called the strong principle of equality, a belief that every member of an association is more or less equally qualified to participate in governing it, a principle that Ian Morris has invoked in his work on the emergence of Greek democracy. For Norberto Bobbio, equality is the essence of democracy, a sentiment echoed by Ross Harrison, for whom equality is in the heart of the democratic system. Of course, for noble statements of this idea of equality, we can also turn to the beginnings of the modern idea of democracy in the West. A particularly noble formulation of it can be found in the Declaration of Independence, in which, as I probably don't need to inform the audience, 13 American states declared that they saw the proposition that all men are created equal as a self-evident truth. Something like this proposition has become a foundational principle of the representative democracies that can be found in nearly every corner of the world today, from Canada to New Zealand. Today's Democrats would usually want to add that women are equal too, but with that important and hard-won correction, a declaration to the effect that we are all equal is one that few of us would hesitate to sign up to. Now, the only problem with statements of the sort that all men, or people, or citizens are equal is that they are, if we interpret them in any of the most natural and obvious manners, rather obviously untrue. People differ in a huge number of ways. They differ in physical features, like their height, eye color, or the efficiency of their immune systems. They differ in terms of intellectual capacities, such as short-term memory and their facility at learning new languages. They differ in the traits that make up their personality type, extroversion, agreeableness, and so on. And they differ in their tastes and preferences for different types of food, art, music, sports, etc. When this is pointed out, Democrats typically retreat to the claim that these aren't the kinds of thing that we have in mind when we say that everyone is equal. We don't mean that everyone is equal in terms of athletic performance or even talent or in their aptitude for board games. Instead, we have some quite different type of equality in mind. Great, the skeptic might reply. What kind of equality do we have in mind? Here, Democrats tend to make some claim about moral equality. Basing democracy on an idea of political equality might seem rather too obviously circular, since if we think of democracy as a system of political equality, justifying it with recourse to an idea of political equality seems to simply stubbornly restate the thesis we are supposed to be supporting. Even with moral equality, though, there are questions that any intelligent skeptic is bound to ask. If we are all moral equals, in what sense are we moral equals? Certainly, the idea that we are all equally moral also seems implausible. After all, people seem to span as wide a range in moral probity, however we might define that, as they do in anything else. If moral equality simply means that we should treat people as equals, why should we? What is it about people that means we should treat them equally? I should make clear at this point that my interest here is not in the historical question of how this commitment to moral equality developed in the societies that happen to have developed it, fascinating though this question is. I'm not going to engage here, for example, with the hypothesis that it was largely Christianity that gave the West the idea of the equality of all persons, except to note that to the extent that Protagoras has an idea of fundamental moral equality, this is obviously a pre-Christian one. I won't have time today to discuss the historically informed work on the evolution of notions of equality in early modern Europe by Teresa Bejan. I also won't have time to discuss Tom Holland's recent account of the Christian influence on the West, one which sees Enlightenment liberalism, which with its professed dedication to equal rights, as ultimately dependent on Christian notions of equality. Though I do wonder whether Holland wouldn't have found similar notions of the oneness or value of all human life in other world religions, had he time to look at them in similar depth. And I won't finally have time to look at Joseph Henrich's recent examination of the evolution of a distinctively Western social mores, in a process that also owes much to the Christian Church. Though Henrich's interest is more in the development of universalistic modes of equality and generalized trusts than in the philosophical idea of equality I want to look at today. What I do want to do instead is ask where this idea of moral equality comes from in a more philosophical sense. Where is it grounded? What is its foundation, or what kind of foundations can we find or make for it? The question is not just an academic one. Skepticism about democracy seems to be on the rise in the West, something that's visible not only in survey results, but also in the development of several new strands of anti-democratic thought. Or I should say newish, since many of the more recent lines of attack will seem familiar to anyone who's read Josh Ober's book on the intellectual critics of Athenian popular rule. Proponents of epistocracy, a hard word for classicists to swallow, like Jason Brennan and Daniel Bell, have stressed the vast variance in citizens' knowledge of politics and their capacity for thinking productively, according to this school of thought, about political problems. A similar school of thought, less academically respectable but more influential online, is the so-called Dark Enlightenment associated with figures such as Curtis Yarvin, who also writes under the fearsome-sounding pseudonym Mencius Moldbug, and Nick Land, one of Yarvin's fellow travelers, has referred to the belief that all men are born equal as not only factually dubious, but rather laughably absurd, and actually, strictly speaking, insane. In brief, the foundational idea that we are all in some sense equal continues to be seen as a weak point in the theoretical armor of democracy. In some sense, liberal Democrats have nobody to blame for this but themselves, at least to the extent that we continue to rest content with the stirring, perhaps now rather naive-sounding, declarations of the French and American revolutionaries. As we have seen, even the slightly more precise idea that democracy is founded on moral equality leaves us with only a vague and therefore rather precarious foundation for democratic theory. Now, I hasten to point out that a number of democratic theorists like Thomas Cristiano and Joshua Cohen have been hard at work trying to develop a more satisfying theoretical basis for democracy. As promising as their ideas are, though, it may be helpful to add another approach to the foundations of democracy into the mix. One of the many ways in which Josh Ober has enriched our sense of how we might think with the ancient Greeks is in seeing them as a resource for theorizing outside the box of modern thinking about democracy. I think that this is another situation in which we might well find something to help us in our thinking about democracy by turning to the ancient Greeks, or to one ancient Greek in particular, that is, Protagoras of Abdera. To be even more specific, I want to turn now to one particular passage of text that is given to Protagoras in Plato's eponymous dialogue. What I have in mind is the so-called Great Speech of Protagoras, a speech that has been widely seen as one of our earliest theoretical defenses of democracy. I probably don't need to convince anyone here that we can indeed take the speech as a piece of democratic theory, despite its context in the dialogue, where its main purpose is to show that political virtue can be taught. I also probably don't need to go into the question of how close the speech is to what Protagoras actually thought about democracy. My guess, for the record, is that Plato wouldn't have gotten away with misrepresenting the famous sophist too wildly. And either way, what we have here is a fascinating and rare example of explicit democratic theorizing from the ancient world, and we are well within our rights to talk about that. If you do have any doubts on either of those fronts, though, I can warmly recommend the two articles on the slide. I shall also warn you that I won't have time today for any detailed engagement with the text of the Great Speech. My aim today will be instead to say what we can adapt from the Great Speech for the purposes of modern democratic theory. Luckily, this is probably the most likely audience in the world to be familiar with this passage. Here, in any case, is a very quick reminder. In his great speech, Protagoras provides both an illustrative story, a mythos, and a more conventional argument, a logos. In Protagoras' story, the mythos, the Titan Epimetheus distributes various capacities to the newly created mortal beings, flying to birds, the ability to live underground to ants, and so on, but he forgets to give any very useful capacities to humans. Thankfully, his brother Prometheus manages to steal fire and technical knowledge and technos sophia for humans, and these gifts, together with an inborn practical skill, demiurgike, techne, allows humans to develop language, to make homes for themselves, and to produce food through farming. The only problem was that they couldn't form political communities, that is, polis, because they didn't have political or social skill, politicae techne, and this led to them being picked off by wild animals. To fix this, Zeus sends Hermes to distribute a sense of justice, dike, and a conscience, eidos, to mankind, stipulating that all humans must receive these capacities, and that anybody found without them, presumably after a certain point, must be put to death. Why must everyone have a sense of justice and a conscience? According to Zeus, it's because political communities couldn't come into being if only a few humans had a share of these skills, as is the case with other types of skill. In the more conventional argument that follows, Protagoras presents an account of punishment which seems to go some way towards explaining Zeus's zero-tolerance stance against those without any cooperative ability. The point isn't that everyone who has any moral failings or makes any social faux pas should be summarily executed, but that those without any capacity for moral learning can't have a full part in the community. This follows from Protagoras' own strikingly progressive account of punishment, in which any penalties inflicted on wrongdoers should be focused on rehabilitation rather than retribution. This type of punishment, though, will be wasted on those who simply have no capacity for moral learning or self-correction. The idea that not having any sense of justice or any conscience makes a person unfit to be part of the polis goes hand in hand with the tendency that Protagoras notices in human social interaction. Whereas we all freely admit to not having certain skills, like flute playing, nobody can get away with simply declaring that they have no moral capacity. This has necessarily been a very quick raid on the text of the Great Speech, but we now have enough, I think, to see how it might offer us a distinctive approach to the foundations of democracy. The first key proposition in Protagoras' account seems to be that all humans are naturally endowed with some social or moral capacity. Protagoras talks about these natural endowments as granted by mythical titans, whereas we might prefer to talk about them in terms of genetics, but the proposition being offered is essentially the same. However it came about, all humans have a moral capacity. At least all humans have these capacities except for a tiny minority that Protagoras might want to call inhuman, and we might prefer to call clinical psychopaths. Protagoras also seems to believe that the basic moral capacity we're all born with is more or less equal, even if it can be developed to different levels with the assistance of a skilled sophist such as Protagoras, who will naturally expect a fee for his work. In the story, we might note all humans' capacities are roughly equal, at least to the extent that both of its main ingredients, a conscience and a sense of justice, are found in virtually everyone. It's not the case that a significant minority of people have a conscience but no sense of justice, or vice versa. The second proposition, a key proposition in Protagoras' theory, is that we all have to have this moral or social capacity if human societies are to exist. Protagoras, or rather Zeus, in other words, seems to take the very strong position that it is a necessary condition for the formation of human communities that absolutely all humans have a moral capacity, again, minus the psychopaths. Here again, we might prefer a more modern formulation, this time in terms of the theory of collective action. Human community, we might prefer to say, is the sort of good that is freely available to all, whatever other people do, and however much of the good of that good others consume. That is, to use the social scientific jargon, it is non-rival and non-excludable. As with all public goods, it can therefore be tempting for others to shirk on their contributions to maintaining a healthy human community. After all, if nobody can stop me enjoying it, even if I don't chip in, why should I bother? A Neo-Protagorean, rather than a strictly Protagorean version of this proposition, may be then not that everybody exercising our moral and social capacities is necessary for societies to exist, but that the nature of communal flourishing as a public good generates an obligation on all of us to exercise our moral and social capacities. The third key proposition I believe Protagoras is advancing here is implicit in the second, but it's worth stating it here in order to draw out its full implications. It is that the obligations and expectations that flow from moral capacities are markedly different to those that flow from other capacities. There is no general expectation or obligation to be a skilled flautist, or to be an expert shipmaker or doctor, but we do all have some obligation to exercise our moral capacity. That's why, as Protagoras says, we're expected to be honest if we can't play the flute, but simply declaring that we have no moral or social capacities would simply be madness, mania. There are thus two constraints that operate on our moral capacities that do not operate on other sorts of human capacities or skills. First of all, everyone is born with some moral capacity, whereas not everyone is born with the capacity to play the flute. Secondly, because we have a universal obligation to exercise our moral capacity, because we develop our moral capacity mainly through social interaction, there are no real moral experts and ignoramuses, in the same way as there are musical or scientific experts and ignoramuses. This leads to the very situation that Socrates asks Protagoras to explain and that prompts the great speech. The fact that, in the Athenian assembly, the assembled people will not tolerate anybody giving expert advice on topics such as shipbuilding who is not a recognized shipbuilding expert, but they routinely tolerate pretty much any man having a say about the affairs of the polis, even if he's not an expert in politics. The Protagorean view is not, of course, that there are no experts at all, or that they shouldn't be consulted in their areas of expertise. The point is rather that claims to expertise on moral or social or political matters are on much thinner ground than in other spheres of life, because of the relatively equal distribution of moral capacities. Protagoras' account of the foundations of democracy, then, also suggests a way of delineating the sphere of life in which democracy's claims hold up, or to put it another way, the political sphere. For Protagoras, politics is a distinctively normative activity, a kind of cooperation that has to do preeminently with what we ought to do and what we should do, and not so much with the probable consequences of particular courses of action. Of course, democracies may well want to consult with technical experts, economists say, or energy engineers, about what exactly various policy options would likely lead to. When it comes to making the sorts of difficult trade-offs that often face us as communities, though, none of us, or so Protagoras might argue, can claim the relevant kind of expertise, that is, moral or social expertise, because moral capacities are more equitably distributed and cultivated. This furnishes us with something of a response to Bell and Brennan's epistocracy, one that can accommodate some of their points about how some voters are much less informed when it comes to factual matters. And we even seem to have a confirmation in another Platonic dialogue, the Theaetetus, that Protagoras saw practical and moral decision-making as distinct. In the Theaetetus, Socrates formulates an improved version of Protagorean relativism, according to which each polis is necessarily right about its own decisions, but only when the relevant decisions are about politics, peri politikon, and not about whether a certain law is advantageous or not, or about the truth. Note that the three examples of political issues, what is honorable or not, just or not, or pious or not, are all moral and social. This Protagorean approach to delineating the political sphere can also provide us with a response to those other critics of democracy who have seen a weak point in Enlightenment pronouncements about the equality of man. Humans, for Protagoras, and he does, I should note, use the word anthropoi throughout, are equal in the following way. We are all born with a roughly equal moral capacity. Because moral capacity is crucial to securing the practical good of living in a community, we also have roughly equal obligations to exercise and develop our moral capacities. Our moral know-how, then, will be roughly equal in a way that our expertise in chess or ballistics or statistical modeling are very obviously not. Having given you the quickest sketch of the Neo-Protagorean account of democracy's foundations, I want to close just by noticing two features of the theory that represent, I think, significant challenges to its adoption by modern democratic theorists, but that may also open up possibilities for thinking about democracy in a new way. or I should perhaps say an extremely old way. The first is that Protagoras' theory is not in any way contractarian. His humans are not delivered from a primitive state of nature by signing away their freedom to any Leviathan. What allows them to form viable communities and states is instead a set of moral capacities that are instilled in them by the gods, or as we might prefer to say, by nature. Unlike for Hobbes, then, in whose vision justice is created by the state, for Protagoras, a sense of justice is already present in each of us. Rather than outsourcing our collective action to a third-party enforcer in the form of a state apparatus, we build our own states and our own democracies through non-hierarchical cooperation. For those of us who have always been attracted to more participatory forms of democracy, this approach holds a certain appeal. That appeal may be limited, though, in a world whose democracies have long depended on a certain distance between the people themselves and the institutions that represent them. A second challenging but perhaps also promising feature of Protagoras' approach is the emphasis he puts on the constant exercise and development of our moral capacities through association with other people. Hopefully, me labeling that as a challenge doesn't come across as too misanthropic, though the theory will obviously have its drawbacks for introverts. The more substantive theoretical problem is that if Protagoras' emphasis on social or political activity opens up possibilities for participatory democracy, it also seems to present a legion of difficulties for liberalism. If we view political activity, as Protagoras seems to, as part of a spectrum that includes social and even moral activity, what becomes of that distinction between public and private worlds that played such an important role in the liberalism of Josiah Berlin, for one? Here there may be a way through if we remember that Protagoras' approach limits egalitarianism to moral or normative areas. More precisely, we only have a right and an obligation to exercise those moral capacities which are crucial to the viability of our communities. And that may well carve out some space for other human capacities and tendencies to flourish in ways that individuals might choose, free of strong forms of moral obligation from the community as a whole. That, though, is probably enough of a sketch of a Neo-Protagorean approach to the foundation of democracy for now. And I know this audience is endowed not only with roughly equal moral and social capacities, but also with a good deal of genuinely expert knowledge about ancient Greek philosophy and political theory. I'd be very happy to hear any of your thoughts.